So, in the talk I'm going to give today, with apologies to people who have already read my book, I thought what I would try and do is bring out some of the themes from the parts of it about the empire, but also try and think more specifically about how this conference was framed, and bring in a little bit some of the things I've been thinking about since I published the book, which I'd be interested in getting your feedback on. And I guess I wanted to start with the title because I thought it was an interesting and ambiguous title, Looking for the National Dream. What is the national dream, after all? And I think that's something we'll talk about tomorrow. Is it a dream of a new nation and a new home overseas? Or is it a dream of making a better world back home through settlement overseas, through remittances, through return migration? The title of the conference generated some other questions for me as well. What else were migrants dreaming of aside from nations when they left home? I keep coming back to that question, I guess, of national indifference. And one of the questions that I continuously ask myself is, to what extent our framework for understanding migration been shaped by the nationalist paradigms through which people have analyzed it over the last 100 years? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The answers to all of these questions are clearly complex and remain so, and I think your papers all provide really interesting and different ways of answering them. But I thought I'd start with one of Austria's most famous emigrants and dreamers, the journalist Louis Adamance. He's one of my favorite characters in my research, in the research I did about Austria, because his writing is so beautiful. He also died a very mysterious death. His entire life is very interesting. Adamance set out from his native village, here's a picture of him, of Blado, in the Austrian province of Carniola in 1913 at the age of 15. And he had been dreaming of America since his very early childhood, thanks to the influence of the Amerikanci, I'm not quite sure how it would have been pronounced in Slovene. But migrants who returned home after a sojourn in the United States. These Americans were everywhere since, as we know, at least 30 to 40% of immigrants from the Habsburg lands ultimately returned home in the early 20th century, and we get to learn more about that from Anne-Marie Steidl's paper. Most of the Bohunks came to America intending to stay 2 or 3 years, 4 at the most, work to the limit of their endurance at whatever they might find, save every cent possible, and then returning to the old country, pay the debt on the old place, buy a few additional heads of cattle, and start anew, he recalled. And these returnees were often the greatest propagandists for emigration. He remembered experiencing a thrill every time one of the men of the little community returned from America, returning as a celebrity who would buy everybody beer and sausage and tell extraordinary tales of what they'd experienced. The young Adamance did dream of nations. He joined the Slovene nationalist movement as a gymnasium student in Ljubljana and emigrated to escape being imprisoned for his nationalist activities. But what's interesting is that he later recalled that his motivations for joining the nationalist camp were more adolescent than ideological. He wrote, "We actually cared little whether our brothers tilled the soil under Austrian domination or within the borders of a Yugoslav country ruled by the King of Serbia. We were in the movement, as I might put it now, for the fun of it, because it was perilous and heart-swelling." Once he arrived in America, he didn't find many other national dreamers either, or at least so he claimed. Instead, he found a community of men who were invested in a vision of potent masculinity. They thought of themselves as fighters, lovers, poets, dancers, singers, and children of the Almighty before it occurred to them that they were also members of definite national and political groups. They were very proud of their endurance at hard physical labor, their reproductive powers, their singing voices, and their ability to carry liquor like men. So what did these men dream of? Habsburg citizens like Adamance traveled in search of many dreams, I think we can say. Higher wages, for sure, but the factors that inspired migration were often deeply personal. People migrated to find a spouse or to flee from one, to escape anti-Semitism or to escape the confining strictures of an Orthodox community, out of lust for adventure or a desire for more security. One of the things I'm really interested in doing more research on at some point is runaways. I think a lot of people who migrate, this is one of the things you find when you get into their stories, did so to get away from their families, actually. And there's a familialist bias, I think, to the way migration history is written that generally assumes that people were either following family members, joining them, or trying to improve the lot of their families. So I just think that's one kind of interesting angle that we haven't thought about so much. They moved between city and country, but also from one rural village to another within the Habsburg Empire, again, as Anne-Marie Steidl and others here have shown. Many of Adamance's own dreams were nourished by his own fantasies of America as a sort of paradise, the typical fantasy. He wrote, in America, one could make pots of money in a short time, acquire immense holdings, wear a white collar, have polish on one's boots, and eat white bread, soup, and meat on weekdays as well as Sundays. So I find it interesting to see what kinds of things meant you had made it in that time and place. Which brings us back to that question of whether migrants found what they were looking for. In reality, there was no consensus about the meaning or the consequences of all this dislocation, either at the individual or the collective level. Some migrants followed successful neighbors, family members, or friends and never looked back, while others returned as soon as they could. And some of them returned home bitter and disappointed and bluntly warned family members and friends to stay home. In America, the work is hard, like in the galleys. You sweat more in 1 day than in a week at home. As long as a man is healthy and can work, then it is good, but if he is not well, he cannot work, and there is only misery. One migrant wrote to his wife, discouraging her from joining him. Moses Weinberger, an Orthodox rabbi from Hungary, offered similar advice to his own peers in Europe. In an 1887 tract, he counseled, "Stay home. Nothing will be left for you to do save dressing in black, wrapping yourself in shrouds, and rolling from darkness to abyss, from factory to sweatshop to itinerant peddling. For such success, you don't need America." Even in Blotto, tales of the Golden Country were not the only stories circulating. Adamance's mother warned her son about other men in Blotto and the vicinity who had gone to America and had sunk, leaving no trace into the vastness of America. She knew of villages not far from our own who had returned from the United States without an arm or minus a leg or in bad health. There was a widow in Podgora, another village nearby, whose husband had been killed in a mine accident. There was Peter Molek, a neighbor who had returned to Blotto to die. Adamance himself, who had strong socialist convictions, ultimately concluded that most migrants go, quote, because each thinks he will get the better of America and not let America get the better of him. Many foreigners have greatly bettered themselves there, but these fortunate ones who are few compared with the multitude of immigrants who I believe would be better off had they remained in the old country. Perhaps some immigrants went to America looking for the gold country but actually found nationalism instead, when in their loneliness or their desperation they were forced to turn to consuls or nationalist cooperative societies or other kinds of communities for social assistance and support. Conflicting stories about life in the New World reached the ears of consuls, state officials, and social reformers. I'm really excited that we have a paper about consuls because they're so important in this story. And they all panicked about mass immigration for their own reasons. Military officials complained about the growing number of conscripts who failed to appear for military duty. Big agricultural landowners worried about rising wages. Religious authorities warned that peasants would be secularized and demoralized in foreign cities. And of course, family members wondered if they would ever see each other again. To many people, American fever and its cousins, Brazilian fever and Argentinian fever, were contagions that threatened to destroy individuals, families, and states. So where does that leave us, and where does it leave the national dream? Today I want to think a bit more broadly about where the field of migration history more broadly might be headed and what we as historians of the Habsburg Empire or of Italy might have to contribute to it. Since this is a conference that looks at Austro-Hungarian migrants in a variety of settings, which is one of the things I think is going to be so interesting tomorrow, in North and South America, I also want to reflect on the ways in which migration to different parts of the world was actually linked in the imagination of people at the time and in the policies of Habsburg citizens. during the period of Great Migration, and how both were tied to the broader politics of empire and what I'm calling deglobalization back at home. And I want to consider both the dreams and the nightmares that propelled migration, return migration, and the migration politics of the late Habsburg Empire. It might seem strange that I use the term deglobalization here, since we are, after all, talking about the diffusion of Habsburg citizens around the globe. And many of you will be speaking about the process by which these migrants formed diasporas, not of Habsburg loyalists, but of Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Slovenes, and so on. But I've been thinking a lot more these days about deglobalization, partly because of what's going around us in the world, the rejection of international migration, trade, and cultural transfer, efforts to become independent of or to gain the upper hand over the global economy at both the individual and the collective level. We're in an intense period of anti-global politics right now in 2017, which I think is comparable to the interwar era, when decades of mass migration and rapid globalization leading up to the First World War gave way to several decades of closed borders, anti-migrant and anti-refugee politics, aspirations for autarky, and resentment against international organizations. And these anti-international, anti-global sentiments were particularly pronounced in those countries that had either been losers or felt like they were treated like losers in the First World War. And this interwar deglobalization is the focus of my current research, of the project I've been working on since I finished this. But deglobalization arguably began already in the late 19th and early 20th century. In the Habsburg Empire, emigration politics and policies reflected a concerted, if ultimately failed, effort to stop or at least direct and control the global movement of people in order to serve the state's own interests. Austrian and Hungarian officials and social reformers adopted three principal strategies to achieve these goals. First, they attempted to police or sometimes curtail emigration, targeting emigration agents and shipping companies, the middlemen, who facilitated migration in particular. Second, they sought to protect migrants overseas and cultivate their loyalties. If you couldn't stop migration, the least you could do is kind of keep your people tied to the homeland. And they did this through the creation of what I think you could see as a transnational welfare state that extended the sovereignty of the state overseas to its citizens who migrated. And third, they attempted to channel mass emigration away from the great industrial cities of North America and toward rural colonization in the southern hemisphere. All of these efforts reflected a view of migration as a tool of population policy and emigration as a tool for solving social and political problems. If only they could direct and control the movement of population, officials believed, they could stimulate the economy and secure Austria's position as a global power. None of these strategies were ultimately very successful, but I think that all still had long-term consequences in terms of migration policy, social policy, and attitudes toward empire and globalization in Central Europe. Most migrants, with the exception perhaps of the nationalist emigres of the First World War, did not take off for North or South America in search of a national dream. Although we have, I think, an interesting case in the Polish migrants who that we read about that in one of the papers, who were going with the idea of creating a new Poland in Brazil. Nor was the Austrian state trying to achieve a national dream through its own emigration policies. Some local nationalists did hope to use migration to alter ethno-linguistic balance sheets beginning in the late 19th century by encouraging the emigration of minorities or by colonizing so-called endangered language frontiers with nationally reliable settlers. And of course, the Hungarian government pioneered this strategy, encouraging the emigration of Slovaks, Croatians, and Germans, while discouraging the departure of Magyars. Local Polish nationalists and anti-Semites also began to hope that they could retain Poles while encouraging the emigration of Jews and Ruthenes. With the collapse of the Austrian Empire into self-declared nation-states in 1918, emigration politics became a much more explicit tool of nation-building, as all of the Habsburg successor states sought to use emigration as a way of creating more nationally homogeneous states. But even if migration policies were increasingly driven by nationalist priorities in the 20th century, it's not clear to me that these priorities always reflected the concerns of migrants themselves. So we might therefore ask why the historiography of migration has remained so attached to nationalist frameworks and questions about how Czechs or Poles or Hungarians or East European Jews did or did not become Americans, just for example. I think that answering this question requires turning back to the scholars who first began to track and study mobility. The first Austrian analysts of migration in the 19th century were generally motivated by the imperatives of imperial statecraft and not by nationalism. They sought to quantify and assess the impact of migration in order to better manage the empire's human and natural resources. Early ethnographers like Karl Freiherr von Schoenig saw migration as a component of the empire's famous unity and diversity and a mark of its quintessentially European character. He wrote, "All of the major tribes of the population of Europe meet in the territory of the empire and mix together to create the most diverse national shades, forming themselves into ethnographic groups and islands, which in their colorful mixture comprise Austria's unique collection of peoples," he declared. As the number of migrants expanded in the late 19th century, demographers initially worried about the social and economic consequences of greater mobility. So in his 1895 analysis of the imperial census, Austrian demographer and statistician and German nationalist Heinrich Rauchberg presented migration within the empire as a positive integrative force, which he thought would result in, quote, a greater intermixing of the diverse national, confessional, and general cultural elements. By contrast, Rauchberg saw overseas migration as a net loss, and this was a common view at the time. Emigrants to the United States, he insisted, are, quote, lost to their Heimat, and in the land of their hopes they are forever submerged into the lowest classes as crude and helpless laborers. But 15 years later, Rauchberg's tone and his message were rather different. In 1910, Rauchberg turned his attention to movement within a single province, Bohemia, and presented it as a zero-sum game. He concluded that more Czech speakers were migrating into predominantly German-speaking regions than vice versa, posing a serious threat to the German community's so-called national property. I think Rauchberg's 1910 analysis reflected a new paradigm in migration research more broadly. Since the early 20th century, analysts of migration have generally assigned a starring role to ethnic, national, or racial groups, starting and ending with the question of how movement across space has strengthened, weakened, or transformed national loyalties or cultures. And this paradigm was a product of expanding nationalist movements within the Habsburg Empire, as well as the racial preoccupations of North American immigration authorities. By 1900, Nicole Phelps has shown us that Austrians and Hungarians could no longer even officially enter the United States. American authorities instead insisted on counting Magyars, Hebrews, Bohemians, Poles, and Moravians. Austro-Hungarian authorities strenuously objected to this practice, but U.S. officials replied that they would not register Austrians because, quote, Austrian was not a race name. It has no significance as to the physical race or language. American authorities, it turns out, were also pursuing a particular national dream, a dream of a white Protestant nation comprised primarily of individuals descended from English and German colonists. An emerging transatlantic school of sociology reinforced the racialization of migrants and migration policies. Where are we? Oh, I don't have my pictures in the right order. In 1910, for example, Booker T. Washington, accompanied by the University of Chicago sociologist Robert Park, set out for Eastern Europe to investigate the causes of mass emigration to America. Washington's self-declared mission was to hunt for what he called the man farthest down on the European continent. In this quest to explore the worst that Europe had to offer, he found rich terrain in Austria. Washington Park skipped Europe's castles, museums, and cathedrals and instead toured Krakow's Jewish ghetto, Prague's YMCA, Bohemian mines, Viennese slums, Adriatic ports, Galician border towns, and tiny Carpathian villages, all in their search for human misery. Washington hoped that by locating the man farthest down, here's a headline, in Europe, he would not only diagnose the root causes of emigration to America, but also find new insight on American racial and social inequalities. And in the process, he projected the racial politics and his own politics onto the terrain of Imperial Austria. By the end of the journey, he had concluded that the peasants, workers, and Jews of Eastern Europe actually had it much worse than African Americans in the South. Quote, "There are few plantations in our southern states where one would not find the colored people living in more real comfort and more cleanliness than was the case here," he argued. He speculated that the arrival of millions of impoverished East Europeans would even create a new kind of racial problem in America. He wrote, "Whatever else one may say of the Negro, he is more like the Southern white man, more willing and able to absorb his ideas and the culture of the white man than is true of any race which is now coming into this country." Of course, American nativists agreed, and only a few years later imposed the strict quotas on the number of Eastern and Southern Europeans who could enter the United States. One of the most influential, ruining all the surprises. One of the most influential texts to emerge from the Chicago School of Sociology in this period, of which Robert Park was also a member, was Florian Znaniecki and William Thomas's Polish Peasant in Europe and America, a 5-volume study of the Polish immigrant community in the United States, especially in Chicago. Znaniecki was a recent transplant from Poland, arriving in Chicago in 1914. Do I have a picture of him? There he is. And before the war, he had been banned from academic appointments because of his nationalist sympathies and had presided over the Polish Emigration Society. Znaniecki and Thomas completed their research for the Polish Peasant during the First World War in Chicago, which was at the time a hotbed of East European exile nationalism. And Znaniecki himself triumphantly returned to the new Polish nation-state in 1920, where he occupied the first Polish chair in sociology at the University of Poznan. The Polish peasant was a product of this context. The invention of the Polish peasant and the Polish immigrant as a sociological type was part of a larger nationalist project, inventing the Polish nation as a unified community and state. Znaniecki and Thomas described the Polish nation as an organic community encircled by, quote, "people of various degrees of cultural development, Germans, Austrians, Ruthenes, Russians, and Lithuanians. Burdened with, quote, the highest percentage of the most unassimilable race, the Jews, Poland is fighting every moment for the preservation of her racial and cultural status," they insisted. For Znaniecki and Thomas, this clash of civilizations extended across the Atlantic. In the Polish peasant, Polish immigrants in America also appear to be at war as they struggle to defend a homogeneous, traditional Polish culture against the American values that encircle them. Throughout the study's 5 volumes, they depict the old world of the Polish countryside and the new world of the American city as mutually exclusive ideal types. Poles are supposedly traditional, hierarchical, bound by their collectivist family values, while Americans are modern, individualistic, and amoral. According to Znaniecki and Thomas, upon arrival in America, Polish families collapsed, social hierarchies crumbled, and migrants descended into criminality. The Polish peasant directly shaped decades of sociological theories and social policies. It was really probably the most influential text in sociology for decades in the United States that pathologized urban minority communities, including African Americans, in terms of alleged family breakdown and cultures of poverty. It was an influence on the 1965 Moynihan Report, among other important texts. Many decades later, American and European social historians, influenced by the rise of labor and ethnic history, began to write new histories of migration from Europe to North and South America, as well as histories of rural-urban migration within Europe. Their underlying goals and motivations were often progressive. They wanted to excavate the experiences of ordinary workers and migrants, to highlight the contributions of immigrants to American society and culture, and to reinforce the values of multiculturalism or pluralism. Not surprisingly, however, they continued to write with ethnic groups as their primary objects, foregrounding questions about how movement diminished or strengthened ethnic loyalties and balance sheets. Most analyze the movement of a single national or religious group from one place to another. And in particular, the histories of Jewish and non-Jewish migration have generally been analyzed separately as almost separate fields, even though I think that their histories were often intertwined and took place for similar reasons. This has begun to change in the last decade with the work of many scholars here, writing new histories that place Austria-Hungary in a broader trans-imperial and global context. Like the social and ethnic histories of previous decades, however, our work is also shaped by contemporary concerns, at least I know mine is, including the rise of border control and security states, global labor markets and economic crises, and the ongoing struggles and politics around migrations around the world. In the late Habsburg Empire, efforts to control mass migration were also tied to anxieties about race, globalization, empire, and sovereignty. Efforts to manage migration long predated the era of mass migration, of course. We could go back to the era of serfdom, which explicitly limited the mobility of individuals who were bound to the land, and which was still a living memory for many people in the 1880s when mass migration began. Heimatrecht was used as a tool to control internal migration throughout the 19th century. And although citizens in the Austrian half of the empire gained a constitutional right to emigrate in 1867, efforts to control migration continued, intensifying in the decades after 1880. In the eyes of many Austrian social reformers and government officials at the time, the seductive propaganda of unscrupulous emigration agents was a major cause of the emigration boom. Much as contemporaries today blame traffickers and smugglers for the waves of refugees and migrants coming to Europe, placing blame on these agents, and especially on Jewish agents, served to obscure the underlying social and political causes of mass migration. It is common knowledge, declared the Austrian War Ministry in 1913, that the majority of immigrants do not actually decide to emigrate out of their own initiative or because of their economic situation, but are rather induced to emigrate by the immoral speculative activity of emigration agents. Blaming and arresting travel agents was, of course, a far simpler and less costly solution to the perceived migration crisis than addressing the social and economic inequalities within Austria and beyond that were propelling mass migration. This focus on Jewish agents also reflected the rise of populist anti-Semitic movements that targeted Jews not only as migrants, but as agents of globalization, as people who facilitated movement. The language used to denounce Jewish travel agents in the press and courtroom borrowed from the standard vocabulary of contemporary blood libel and sex trafficking trials. In 1889, for example, a trial of travel agents from Oświęcim took place in the Galician town of Wadowice. And the agents there were accused of being human traffickers, parasites sucking on our blood, and vampires by the anti-Semitic press. And this is two examples of the kind of anti-Semitic propaganda surrounding the press. Pretty classic stuff. Anti-immigration activism also reflected the rise of new forms of expertise in population politics. The impulse to hoard population reflected classic mercantilist thinking, which held that more people equaled more labor, military, and political power, but there were new concerns driving the panic about emigration in the late 19th century. Experts were increasingly focused on the biological quality of the state's so-called human material, as well as the size of the population. And these concerns inspired officials not only to try to prevent emigration, but to protect migrants abroad. The Austrian War Ministry, for example, claimed that, quote, hard labor in an unfamiliar climate, along with the absence of any kind of social protection, resulted in, quote, the complete physical and moral breakdown of Austrian workers in America. Of course, these accusations were not entirely unfounded. Austria-Hungary was well ahead of the United States, and Austria still is today, in terms of providing basic health and accident insurance for workers. The absence of effective social protection for workers in America meant that left-wing socialists, as well as right-wing conservatives, nationalists, and Christian socialists demanded emigration reform. Ignacy Dzerzhinsky, a socialist delegate to the Austrian parliament from Galicia, testified in a 1912 Trade Ministry investigation, quote, in all of Pennsylvania, in the coal mines of Pittsburgh, and in other factories and mines, there are swarms of crippled Austrian subjects who have received no compensation at all for their misfortune. One, I think, fantastic source that has been underexploited is the files, again, in the consular offices of workers and consuls trying to collect compensation for migrants who have lost arms or legs or been killed in accidents in the United States. There are thousands of these cases, and I think they're really rich, actually. Emigration also provoked intense anxieties about the breakdown of families and the transformation of gender relations. The so-called white slavery panic that swept Austria at the end of the 19th century was part of a broader anti-emigration panic that linked all emigration to slavery. Single female migrants were often depicted as victims of sex traffickers regardless of their actual reasons for emigrating. And many attempts to rescue these women failed miserably when the women concerned declared that they did not need saving. There's 2 new good books out, one by Keeley Sutter-Halstead and one by Nancy Wingfield, that treat this issue in detail. Sensational reporting around sex trafficking was also part of a broader anti-Semitic discourse that targeted Jews as traffickers, but even Jewish activists sometimes associated prostitution with the emigration crisis. Austrian Jewish feminist Berta Pappenheim, also known as Freud's Anna O., traveled to Austrian Galicia in 1903 to gather information about sex trafficking there. She wrote, "The cardinal point of any campaign against the traffic in women is that emigration should receive the greatest attention. Every girl who emigrates and leaves her hometown is vulnerable to all forms of danger and vice." The actual impact of migration on women and gender relations and family relations was, in fact, complex. Social reformers and religious authorities often painted a catastrophic portrait. 3 Austrian bishops in 1914 wrote, quote, "The husband goes to America or the young wife leaves her family to work as a domestic servant. It is only natural that family life is disturbed, and if this situation continues, is totally destroyed." Concerns about the breakdown of patriarchal authority may not have been entirely unfounded. In one Hungarian town, so many men took off to America that women reportedly took up many of the positions in the local government. And there hasn't been an in-depth study of this that I know of, at least in the Austrian context, but in the Italian context, there's a really wonderful book by Linda Reeder called Widows in White that talks all about the effect that emigration from Sicily, I believe, had on gender roles and family relations there. Pauline Reimer left Galicia for the United States at the age of 17 and later recalled, "At home, they give you money when you get married. If you got more money, you get a better husband. You got less money, you know how it is." She told her parents, "Send me to America. I don't want to be here. You can't marry me off, and I don't want to get married either." Her mother objected but let her go, and she moved to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is very near my hometown, and never looked back. Not all women experienced emigration as liberation, however. Some came to America with their husbands and felt isolated and intensely homesick. The emigration of a husband who left his family behind could also mean emotional and financial abandonment. Spouses separated by the Atlantic often feared that they had been completely forgotten. Deserted wives had little chance of obtaining alimony or child support in spite of the creation of these new transatlantic social work organizations that tried to deal with this issue. In New York City, a Jewish philanthropic organization called the National Desertion Bureau attempted to track down delinquent immigrant husbands. Photos of these runaway husbands were even published in the Gallery of Missing Husbands, which was a weekly feature in the Yiddish newspaper Vortrag. I think I have this is the Gallery of Missing Husbands. Apparently one guy stole all the photos in the house so that they couldn't publish his picture. Reports about I found this in the research I was doing on runaways, and the files here are actually really, really interesting. The wives often don't want their husbands to be found because they don't really want to reunite with them. They just want money. They just want support. So there is a lot of interesting dynamics there. Reports about the physical and moral breakdown of emigrants and their families inspired new plans for new forms of social protection for Austrian workers abroad. Dzerzhinsky urged the Austrian government to create institutions to protect emigrants, including expanding consular networks, cooperatives, and boarding homes. He also promoted seasonal migration within Europe as a desirable alternative to emigration to America. And I think it's important to remember, again, as Emery Steidl has written and others, that internal migration in Europe, within the monarchy, and overseas to different places are all kind of connected, both in reality but also in the minds of these policymakers who are trying to manipulate migration. Not only did seasonal migrants enjoy better social protection than workers in America, they were more likely to return home from Germany or from France than from Chicago, or at least in the minds of the officials. But Austro-Hungarian efforts to retain immigrant loyalties faced challenges that did not plague their German and Italian neighbors, such as competition with nationalist movements in the United States. Self-identified Polish, Slovak, Czech, Jewish, and Hungarian associations, homes, and cooperative societies also offered assistance and community to migrants. And they encouraged migrants to think of themselves as Polish Americans, Czech Americans, Hungarian Americans, or Jewish Americans, rather than as subjects of the emperor. Reporting on new boarding homes for migrants in the United States, one Austrian consul lamented that these homes were quote, founded precisely on the rejection of Austrian patriotism. Imperial officials never gave up on their efforts to control migration or protect migrants. Hungary passed the most restrictive immigration law in Europe in 1909, and Austrian lawmakers drafted similar legislation. While the Austrian law was never ratified because of the First World War, it set important precedents for the bilateral immigration treaties that were signed between the successor states and France after World War I, and became model for the new immigration laws in all of the post-war successor states. And arguably, I would say this was the foundation of this emerging transnational welfare state. If mass migration could not be stopped, some migration reformers also hoped to redirect emigration into new productive forms of colonization. These colonial fantasies were nurtured by the fear that Austrian migrants would be reduced to the status of colonial labor in North or South America. Such anxieties intensified in 1907 when the Austro-Americana line introduced direct steamship service from Trieste to Louisiana. I have a picture of the poster. Maybe not. There it is. As recruiters from Louisiana and Georgia began to prowl the Austrian countryside looking for cotton pickers, rumors spread that Austrian peasants were literally replacing former slaves in the American South. In 1908, an Austrian general consul toured Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina to investigate working and living conditions. He reported grim prospects. Since Austrian immigrants would inevitably live and work with the blacks on southern plantations, he feared that, quote, the only possible consequence is that our people will be brought down to the level of the blacks and that they will hardly be better treated. In other words, even as American opponents of immigration worried about protecting America's racial stock against incoming Italians and East Europeans, Austrians were preoccupied with maintaining the status of their citizens as white Europeans. One imagined solution was to redirect mass migration away from North American cities, where citizens were allegedly lost to their homeland, and toward South America, where they had the idea that migrants would settle in enclosed colonies, maintain their language and culture, and perhaps play the role of the colonizer. Habsburg colonial advocates, and there were Habsburg colonial advocates, generally acknowledged that they had arrived too late to the starting line in the race for colonies. Inspired by the examples of Italy and Germany, they instead hoped to project Austrian influence around the world by creating these self-enclosed colonies of settlers within existing empires or states. This was admittedly a consolation prize, but it would have to do. Colonial advocate Friedrich Hay reasoned, since all of the appropriate parcels of Africa have long been in secure hands, we have no choice but to content ourselves with the surrogate of peaceful colonization. He hoped that these enclosed colonies would remain in lasting contact and economic relationship with their homeland to the benefit of our industry, our shipping firms, our commerce, and trade. But settlement outside of Europe and North America also seemed fraught with peril. What if instead of becoming self-sufficient pioneers or landowners, East European workers themselves sunk to the status of non-white slave labor? The outbreak of Brazilian fever in the 1890s brought these questions to the forefront of public debate. Conservative newspapers dispatched reporters to Brazil who warned of terrifying attacks by natives, locusts, and ants, reporting that settlers were working in slave-like conditions on the brink of starvation, and the Hungarian government eventually banned emigration to Brazil completely. For the most part, colonial ambitions were not realized. The majority of migrants were indifferent to the imperial or nationalist ambitions of their governments, and while many migrants did go to South America, it was probably not because they were directed there by the government. Migrants continued to follow the lead of family and friends who migrated before them. Efforts to channel emigration toward colonial settlement did, however, gain steam in the context of Jewish territorial and Zionist movements. And after the First World War, many successor states concentrated their efforts on what they called internal colonization, which was supposed to substitute for overseas colonization or emigration and enable independence from the global economy. In the 1930s, for example, Poland developed a significant colonial movement, even demanding colonies from the League of Nations. I think there is more promising research to do on these emigration empires constructed out of existing diasporas, following the example of Mark Choate's work, who is with us here today. I also think we have a great deal to contribute to the field of global history more generally by writing it from a starting point other than the British Empire or the United States. Where does this story end? I would argue that the history of anti-migration movements in the Habsburg Empire is part of a history of migration and globalization that continues today. Today, borders in places like Hungary, Serbia, Austria, Slovenia, and Croatia are crowded with refugees desperate to get in rather than clawing their way out. East Europeans, at least for the moment, enjoy unprecedented freedom to move within Europe's borders, often at the expense of those outside of them. Legally, at least, they have attained the status of white Europeans, guaranteed the same rights and privileges as West Europeans, including the right to mobility within the EU. In the United States, Donald Trump, our president, is married to a Slovene immigrant, Melania. His first wife, Ivana, was an immigrant from the former Czechoslovakia. And he sees no contradiction, of course, in having a Central European immigrant as First Lady while attempting to ban Muslims or build a wall on the Mexican border. But as recent anti-Polish violence in Britain suggests, the status of East European migrants remains precarious. And I think it's interesting that many Brexit voters seem to have been voting against Poles as much as against Muslims. At the same time, right-wing populist movements and governments across Europe, but particularly in Eastern Europe, appear to be invested in erecting an iron curtain around the continent's edges. This may seem like a great irony, but it's consistent with a deeper history that links popular sovereignty to national homogeneity, with long-standing ambivalence toward migration more broadly, and with East Europeans' position of insecurity within the European community. The anti-immigration movement of Imperial Austria, like the anti-migration movements that we experience today, reflected a backlash against the perceived threats posed by global migration and trade. It was driven by fears that Central Europeans would be the economic, political, and cultural losers in a process that was uprooting millions, dividing families, and dissolving communities. Equally important, mass emigration intensified the state's fears of losing sovereignty over both its borders and its people. If we are to do justice to the history of mobility, I think we need to be attentive not only to the ways in which migration represented hope to millions of people who were looking for the national dream or other dreams, but also to the ways in which migration was experienced in terms of loss, decline, and unfreedom. Then and now, opponents of migration were also looking for the national dream, only they dreamt of homogeneous national communities with impermeable borders, self-sufficient and independent of the global economy. Both of those dreams made Central Europe in the 20th century and continue to shape our world today. Thanks.